So if we talk about CSS, so let me give you a brief introduction about CSS first. I guess Adil have told you about HTML, how HTML works, and how do we get started with HTML, right? So okay, so he has created a basic HTML uh, page.
Yeah, so we did cover HTML yesterday, and we went over the basic tags. We went over what attributes are and how to add links, how to add images.
Yeah.
And we did briefly went over CSS in that we just added a text color to the links.
Okay. 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 So I guess so you have explained what is the actual use of CSS, right?
Yeah, kind of. Not
Oh,
in detail, but just a very brief overview.
okay, so let's take an example for so that you will get an understanding of how what is the actual use of CSS. So let's take an example of a building. Okay, so there is a building. So if we divide that building in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, so the HTML, if we talk about the HTML particularly, so the structure of the building, right? The building which are beams and columns, right? So though that is exactly the HTML part. Now, once the beam and columns and all the things are done, so we have to apply some paint and everything. So that the building looks really good. It should look uh, like it's a luxurious building or something like that. So for that, we'll be using like CSS to apply some styling and everything. And if you talk about JavaScript, I'll give a brief introduction about JavaScript as well. Why do we use it? So if we take the same example for the building, so let's say we have to install a lift in a building. So we have to automate some stuff, right? So lift automates the going up and down to the multiple floors. So that is the purpose of of the JavaScript in a website. So this is kind of a basic example how like HTML and CSS and JavaScript works. Hope you guys get understanding about all the three things. Adin, over to you.
Right. So yeah, thanks for the introduction. So we did saw how to use a little bit of CSS yesterday. Today, let's go a bit deeper into that. Before that, yesterday we imported CSS into our JavaScript file because we already had imported our JS file over here. But let's just say that we do not have our JS file imported over here. In that case, the method to directly import a CSS file is by using a link tag, which once again is an HTML tag. And on the link tag, we need to provide two attributes. One of them is the relationship, which in this case is the style sheet. So this denotes that we are importing a style sheet. And by the way, CSS stands for cascading style sheets. So it's that style sheet. And the next thing is the href. Href is similar to the anchor tag. And over here, we will be pointing to our the CSS file that we have over here inside the src folder. So this will be src/styles.css. And then we'll just close this link tag. And as you can see, we still have our, okay, we did lose our colors. Let's try to figure out why. Let's just refresh it first. Okay. Yeah, so our styles are now imported, and as you can see, we still have our colors, which means that this is working. Let's quickly try to change a color to verify it. And it changes to green. So this is basically how CSS works. You import the CSS file, and inside the CSS file, you need to select your targets to which you want to apply the styles. And on those targets, you need to provide the styles for those targets. So here we selected the anchor tag and we provided a color of red. which made this link red. And then we selected a visited link, so a link which we have already visited, and we gave it the color green. And just like color, there are a few CSS properties which are available for every type of HTML tag. These are one of them is color, another one is text align. So these are the ones that you can use anywhere for any type of tag. We have width, which let's just say is 10px. Don't worry if you are not able to understand something right now. We'll be going over everything in detail. We have height. Then we also have a margin. We can give it a padding as well. Then everything can have a border. And we can also supply font related tags, font family, font size, also font weight. So let's leave it 800. Now let's try to refresh this. And let's see if there are any changes. All right, no changes visible right now. But so these are the properties that you can give to basically any tag that you want. These can be used for any type of element, and they will mostly work either directly on that element or for the children of those elements. So I guess this HTML should mostly be clear now. We provided a head, body, we added a form, we added some paragraphs, we went over lists, we went over footer, how to add an image, how to add links, and then we also saw how to take in the user's input and yeah, what divs and spans are. So let's leave this right now at its current state, and let's move on to a new project basically. Let's start with a clean slate for today. Let's get rid of head entirely for now. And it's inside the body, inside the div, let's add one single line of text. Global. Okay, this works. Let's add a head. Let's import our CSS, which is done using this link tag, where the relationship is of style sheet and href for now is src/styles.css. And this opens up. And as you can see, as soon as I imported this, the font style changed. Right now it's a serif font. I do this and it becomes a sans serif font. All right. So let's keep body as it is for now. And let's come back over here. Good. So we now have our a very basic web page, which has just a single line of text. Now inside this div, let's say we want to select this div and add some styles to it. So the way to select all the divs, like whenever you encounter a div, the way to select that is by simply using an element selector. We can just write div and provide the styles to it over here. And let's try to just simply modify this to a serif, and this works. And if we try to add a color, this looks good. The color can be changed over here. But the side effect of using element selectors is that they select everything. So they would select all of the divs, not just the first div or not just the one single div that you want to select. And in order to select a single div or any single element, we can use the ID attribute. So for the second one, let's give it an ID of red div or just red div. And yesterday we did use ID at a place. That was to scroll down to the image. We don't have it over here, but yes, over here. Right. So we did saw that if we add an ID, we were able to scroll down to that ID or scroll up to that the place where the element with that ID was present. And in order to identify that we are giving it an ID, we use the hash symbol. Similarly, we would be doing it over here in the style sheet as well. Whenever you want to select an ID, we would be using the hash symbol and then give it the ID, give it the color, red, save it, and this becomes red. So yeah, this is how basically CSS works. You select an element or a type of element or multiple different elements, and then you write some styles for those elements. And whatever properties those styles contain are applied to those elements, and using those properties, you can change the look and feel of your website. So you can change the font, you can change the color, you can make something bigger or smaller. You can also change the position of something. And that's what CSS does. So using HTML, we were able to create the skeleton of our page, the layout, the content of our page. But using CSS, we would be able to make it look good. We would be able to make it look unique or make it look as how we want it to look. And yeah, so this is how we targeted a div. We targeted a div. We targeted a specific div with an ID, and we targeted divs in general. But let's say that I have a bunch of different divs, and I want these three to be red, and then this to be blue, and this is fine as it is. How do I do that? Because copying the ID would not be an ideal solution. So for these cases where we want to apply a single style to multiple different elements, we can make use of something called classes. Now, classes are written with a dot symbol in front of them. So the way to do that is you write a dot, and then you can select. Basically, let's change the color for a second. Instead of red, let's make it something other than red and blue. So let's call it green. So this is green, this will be green, and then this will be green as well. Now if we come over here and we add a class called green text, then give it a color of green. The next step is to give the classes to these divs, because until these divs are given the classes, they won't know that this is what this is the style that they have. This is the style that they need to show. And the way to do that is by simply coming over here and just writing the name of the class in the class field. Now should be dot green text, and this becomes green. But we don't want this to be green. We wanted this, and this to be green. So as you all saw, and this is how you change the colors. And this is how, these are the different ways to select an element, to select either a single element, select a group of elements, or select a specific type of elements throughout your document. And there can be a few more scenarios where, let's say you have this div. Let's take the last one. Okay, let's focus on this. And inside of this, let me create another div. Where I want this to be a child of blue. This is blue's child. And let's create another div inside of this. And this is blue's grandchild. Right. And what I want to do is, I want my outer div to be of a larger size. So let's give the font size property to this. Let's make it 20px for now. Just to make it a bit more clear, let's make it 40px. So let me just add a few more comment sections over here. Just to separate it. Now, if I want to select all divs which are children of this div, let's give it an ID. This would be loaded. Or rather, let's keep it a parent div. So this is the parent div. This would be, let this just be a div for now. All right. And on our parent div, we want to make the size even bigger. So let's give the font size of 60px to this. So this is our parent div, and then these two are its children, and we want the children to be smaller. Basically, what we want to do is we want to select only the divs that are a child of this div. And the way to do it is by first writing the parent's name, writing this symbol.
Adin sir, can you please zoom out the screen a bit because it's not visible to few participants.
Zoom in or zoom out?
Zoom in. Yeah.
This should be fine now. Okay, is it visible now? Let me know.
Yes, sir.
All right, so we add this symbol, the closing angular bracket, also known as the greater than symbol, I think. And then we write the child that we want to select. So all divs that are a child of this parent div would be selected, and if we apply some style to it, currently we wanted to make it smaller, and we also want to change the color, let's say. Okay, so now as we can see that this div is selected, which was an immediate child of the parent div. the font size was reduced, the color was reduced, the color was changed basically. But this div or this div, which was actually a grandchild, was not selected. So using this greater than symbol or the closing angular bracket, we can select just the immediate children of any other element. But what if I also wanted to select this? What if I wanted to select all the children of a parent div? The way to do that is using something known as a descendant selector. So this was a child selector, and the next thing that we're going to see is a descendant selector. Instead of any symbol, you just have to write a space. And after the space, just write div. Now if I change this, you can see that this was applied to both of them. But if I change the font size to something called 50, this would also be applied to both of them. But if I move this to the bottom, right? So this is how CSS basically works. It starts at the top and it keeps on adding more styles as it gets them towards the bottom of the file. So anything that's written at a later point of time at the bottom of a file or something that's imported after your main CSS, that will take precedence. So yeah, do let me know if there are any questions or queries till now. And
Okay.
is there anything?
Okay, so can I, okay, so if we can brief what Adil just taught us. So CSS stands for cascading style sheets. And as I told you before, it is used to, make your web page look beautiful, to apply some styling, apply colors and font sizes as well. So we can apply CSS to any particular tag using a class or a ID. So if you want to apply any CSS, let's say you want to change the font size of a div or a paragraph tag. For that particular paragraph tag, you'll provide a unique ID, and you will write the CSS for that particular ID, and it will get applied to that paragraph tag. And let's say you want to apply that particular CSS to multiple elements in your HTML page. So what you'll do is that you'll create a class, you will write your CSS into that particular class, and you will add that class name to the elements in which you want to apply that CSS. So this is what about this is like the basic of CSS, like to start with and to go on. And we also have inline CSS as well. We can write the inline CSS as well. Adil, I guess you haven't written the inline CSS yet, right?
Yeah, I haven't written inline CSS, but we did briefly discuss it.
Yeah.
Let me just give you an example, but I would also like to very clearly say to everyone that try to avoid inline CSS whenever you can. Because in most of the cases, what you would want to do is you would want your CSS to be at a single place. You don't want it to be specific to a single element. You want it to be more generic. You want it to be reusable, and you want your entire code to be a bit modular. And writing inline CSS does not help with any of that. So try to avoid this, but in case if it's required, this is how it's done. You just use the style attribute, and then within the quotes, you can write the styles. So styles are basically the same thing that we have written over here. Let's copy the font size. And remember, this is the first thing that we are changing. Oops. Yeah. If I change this to 10, it became small. I change this to 90, it became big. This is how you can write it in line. The properties remain the same, even if it's doesn't matter if it's in line or if it's in a CSS file. But the attribute, it changes. So right now you're providing a style. If you're using class, you provide classes. and otherwise you can directly select an element directly. So that is how it's done. Now there are also a few more selectors available to you.
Sir, I
These
have a
will-
question.
Yeah.
Sir, if we put the style over here in the HTML that we done earlier, like div style is equals to font size pixels, and also we import the class from style.css. What style will it be considering?
So as I said, it would depend on what comes later on. Right. So whichever comes later on would have precedence. And
Later
there
on
are
will have the presence or the first one?
Okay, so inline styling will be applied
Okay.
if you are using class. So there is a keyword called exclamation mark important, right? So if you write important in any of the CSS, so if you write it anywhere in class or in inline CSS, so if HTML page sees that it's an important tag, so it will get applied even if you wrote any other class, even if you assigned any other class to that. So, and if
Please
you talk,
illustrate that one.
sorry,
Can you please illustrate that one?
Yeah, so let's just do one thing. Let's add a CSS over here. We had ID red div, which made the color red. Let's try to change the color using inline CSS, sorry, inline styles, and give it color of yellow. Save it and it became yellow. So as I said, whatever comes later on, in this case, style, even if you put style at the first, it won't matter really. Will be yellow. So this will take precedence because in the hierarchy of things, this comes later on than this, or whatever CSS selects. And in case of within a CSS file, if you have multiple rules targeting something, then whichever comes later on will have precedence that will override the previous thing. So if I make my font size 80 over here and change this to 20, then you can see that this has a font size of 80. But if I move it towards the top and save it, then this has a font size of 20 now.
Sir, can you put the important keyword in the red div part?
Yeah.
Red div, so that it will overtake. Thank you.
Now, there may also be cases where you have used important a bunch of different times and the importance have a conflict. In those cases, as I said yesterday, there won't really be an error shown to you. Right? Just like yesterday, even if we gave it some wrong HTML, there was no error message, just the rendering was a bit incorrect, not how we wanted it to be. Similarly, if you have multiple importance, then the one that came later on would work, I think. I'm not exactly sure. So the best way to try it out would be to actually just try it out. You can experiment it. You will have the link to this file. Feel free to make any changes and try a bunch of different things, whatever you want.
Thank you, sir.
So this is how basically CSS works. We add some properties, we select some things, and then whatever has been selected gets those properties assigned to it. All right, and yeah, so these are the properties, these are the selectors, this is how it's done. After this, what we need to do is, yeah, we have a few more selectors. The two other selectors that we have are called pseudo class selector and the pseudo element selector. We did see one of those yesterday. Over here, yeah. So colon visited. this was a pseudo class selector. Visited is called a pseudo class, which is not a class that we give explicitly. It's a class that is kind of, think of it as a class that's implicitly given to an element. So whenever we click on a link, a visited class is given to that element. And then whatever is written inside this visited class will be, all of those properties would be assigned to that element. So those are pseudo classes. And then there's also a pseudo element selector. And there are a bunch of different pseudo elements. Yesterday we saw placeholder. So in order to select a placeholder, you can use the placeholder pseudo element. And once that is selected, you can give any styles to the placeholder. So we don't have a placeholder over here right now. Let's just go back to yesterday's code. Zoom out a bit. And let's select this placeholder of this input over here. So this is the input. Let's give it a class called input. Should be visible now. And let's come over here. Let's add a class input, but we don't really need to change the styles for input. We just need to add a placeholder over here. So we selected the placeholder of input, and over here, let's try to change the color. Let's give it a red color. And as you can see, the placeholder was selected with the red color. So this is how it works. Now, once we have selected a bunch of different elements, we can give it a bunch of different properties, as we just saw. And there are also more specific selectors to select the children, select siblings, select a specific type of an element. And apart from these few that we saw, the child selector, we saw the descendant selector, and we saw the pseudo class and pseudo element selector. Apart from these, there are also a few others, namely we have an attribute selector, and then there's a sibling selector, so it selects adjacent siblings. And those are not very commonly used. If you want to read more about them, go to this website. We saw this yesterday. Go to MDN Docs. On this MDN Docs, you have references. Go to the references. Scroll down, you'll have CSS, and you'll basically have everything. You'll have you'll know more about how to style things, how to style text, and how to even add animations and the different types of style patterns available to you. So do check it out. Just like yesterday, the links will be shared after the session with you. Now, we saw a bunch of things, but let's try to experiment more with a few other properties. So let's focus on the div. This basically targets all the divs. Let's try to add a border to it. And the border should have a thickness of, let's say, 2 pixels. And it should be a solid border. It should have a color of, it should be red in color. And this is how it looks. So all of these divs have been assigned a border. And yeah, since this div selected everything. If I move this border over to red div, only this will be selected and the style would be applied to this. Now, just like HTML, there were a lot of tags. CSS has a lot of properties, like too many properties. And it's actually impossible to remember all of them. These are all the properties that you have. So the best way to do is to practice, build things, and you will be soon, you will very soon be familiar with the most common things that you need to know, that you absolutely need to know. You would memorize them automatically. And for the other things that you would be rarely using, you can always come back to this page and you can always refer it. But do read through all of these at least once so that you know what is available to you. Because unless you don't know what's available, you won't really be able to refer to it. So just like color and border, we have a bunch of properties. And instead of going through all the properties, I would like you all to go through all of them, or if not all of them, the most common ones. Now, these were the properties. Apart from the properties, we do have a few different systems that you need to be aware about, namely the grid system and the flex system. These are mostly used for making your website responsive. So right now, if you take a look at this website, this has all of the things in a single column. Every element is on a single column, no matter what the size of the viewport is, size of the browser is, everything would remain on a single column. But let's say I want to keep two of them on the same row. The way to do that would be, there are multiple ways to do that, and the most preferred way and the most current modern way to do that is using Flexbox. What Flexbox basically does, just to give you a brief overview, is that it flexes, it changes its size, changes the size of the elements depending on the size of your viewport. Viewport refers to this window where your content is. This is how a flex. And so basically what a Flexbox would do is it would keep an item over here, add the other items in a row as long as there is space. When the space gets over, it would move the next item to the next line. Let's try it out. So let's make our body flexible. Let's give it a display of flex. And let's see what happens. Right, so previously all of our divs were vertically, one above the other. Now they are horizontally placed. But I promised that Flexbox would move them down for you. But as you can see right now, it's not doing that for you. That's because we are missing a few more rules, a few more properties that we need to add, and we need to be aware about it. So before you do that, the one thing that you need to do whenever you start a new project, remember this, is to define your viewport. The way to do that is using a meta tag. What a meta tag does, what attributes it, what are the attributes that it accepts, and what's its basic purpose is. In order to know these things, I would it would be great if you can go back to the MDN Docs that I shared yesterday. Go to the HTML reference section and check out the page for meta tag. But how you do it is you give it a name of viewport, so we know that we are defining the viewport. And then in the content, we define the viewport as having the width equal to device width, and we give it an initial scale of 1. And then always remember to close everything that you open. So you need to add this. Once you've added it, you've defined your viewport. Viewport is the screen. Just think of it as the screen. Think of it as the visible part of your website on the screen. So this is my current viewport. If I change it, this entire thing becomes my new viewport. And yeah, viewport is whatever space that's available for your website to show the content. And it can be different based on whether you're using a mobile or whether you're using a desktop or a tablet. So we have defined our viewport and we have made our body flex. The next thing that we need to do is to so before we actually do something, let's also talk about backwards compatibility. So this is currently not really supported on some older versions of Internet Explorer. And in order to add that, the way to do it is add MS Flex, I think. Give it a value of 1. Okay, so we also need to define flex and give it a value of 1. Right, so MS Flex is basically needed to support Internet Explorer. And whenever you're working with CSS, browser compatibility can be an issue. Some rules work differently on Firefox than on Chrome. And some properties are just outright not supported in Safari or Internet Explorer. But there are a bunch of different ways to make them work on these different platforms. So if you're working with Flex on Internet Explorer, you need to add this. However, if you're working with Flex and you're using Internet Explorer, you also need to think about a few other things in your life. So we have added a Flex of 1. Then we also need to add a few more properties. Let's add Flex direction, which would give us the direction of the elements. And let's keep it to row for now. And let's see what happens. So if we add the flex direction of row, nothing changes. This is how it remains. However, do note that this was our parent and these are the children. They are still in a column because they are the children of this element, and these are not in a flex box. Like this element is part of body, is a direct child of body. Body has flex. This element does not have flex, and so the children do not have flex. The children are still vertically arranged. Now let's try to change this. Let's change it to column. Save it, and we're back to kind of where we started from in a column. There's also row reverse and column reverse. Let's quickly check those out before we move on. So row reverse, just as the name, it reverses the order of the elements. Column reverse, I suppose, should do the same. It reverses the order. So we've added flex direction. The next thing to do is to actually make it wrap. So right now, if I reduce the size of my viewport, some elements are getting cut off. What I want to do is I want them to be wrapped down to the next line. And the way to do that is using a flex wrap property. And let's say that I want these to be wrapped. So as long as the viewport has enough width, enough horizontal width to accommodate all of the elements that we are giving it, those will be in a row. And whenever the space ends, we would move on to the next row. Right. You can see each element moving up and down as we increase and decrease the size. And Flex is the basis of modern responsive design. If you use something like React Native, you would be using Flex. If you want to like make any mobile first application, you would mostly be using Flex. And Flex is a good way to flex on other websites that don't use Flex. But apart from Flex, we also have a grid system. And other than the grid system, there's also media queries. Let's cover media queries first before we go on to the grid system. And the way media queries works is that it asks your browser, it queries your browser for a bunch of details. These details include what type of media that you're trying to show, whether you're showing it on a screen, whether you want this website to be printed, what are the different features that you want the website to accommodate. So you can get the height of the screen or the page that you want to print. You can get the width, you can get the orientation, and a bunch of other properties, which you can check out in the CSS reference for media queries. And how to write a media query is very simple. Let's focus on our parent div. Let's this. Let's add 60 over here. And yeah. So let's say whenever we are on a desktop or a laptop, we want this. Actually, let me just change the text to hello. Right. So whenever I'm on a desktop or a laptop, let's say I want a size of 60 pixels. And whenever I move down to a mobile or a tablet, I want to reduce the size or change the color, let's say. In order to do that, the first thing that I need to do is to write a media query, which means I want to get the data from the browser about what kind of media it's trying to display. Let's say I want to get the details about the screen. So we write at media, and then after a space, we write screen. This will give us display about the screen. And in the screen, we basically want to target the screens that have max width of let's say 300 pixels, just an arbitrary number. Now, whenever our screen has a max width of 300 pixels, we want the font size to be 20. We want the color to be changed to red. Now let's save it. Now let's see. This is our parent. Clearly the width right now is greater than 300, which is why we are seeing the previous rules. But let's try to gradually reduce the width and see if we have done it correctly or not. Right. So at some point over here, right, just about here, the width of this viewport, it changed to a value smaller than 300. And whenever that happens, whatever styles are written within a media query, they are enforced. And whenever we don't match this criteria, right now it's max width of 300 pixels. So whenever we move away from this, then think of it like this style, like this, these properties are removed, and whatever was written before it or after it would take its place. And you can use this for a bunch of different screen sizes. So instead of just 300, let's also target 500 pixels. Let's change this to yellow. And at 500, let's keep it at 40 pixels. Save it. Right, so clearly right now we are at a point where the width is greater than 500. Now our width became 500, so the text size reduced, the color changed. Let's go down where the width became 300 or smaller, and nothing really happened. Can anyone guess why is that? Feel free to unmute yourself and try to guess why this happened. Or even in the chat as well. Right, sequence. So we need to move the 500 above this because technically it would still match. Right, so now it changed. And then when we came down to 300, it changed once again. Cool. So this is how media queries work. There are a bunch of different properties that you can query for. There are a bunch of different conditions that you can add. Just like yesterday, go on to the reference page. There should be something for media queries over here. Check this out. And before we continue further, check out the code for today's attendance. This is the code. You have 1 minute. Feel free to take a screenshot or write it down somewhere and then add it in the form for your attendance today.
Guys, we have sent the attendance form on the chat also. It is pinned on the Discord channel also. Note down the code. Only the people who have attended the session for 25 minutes or more and will fill this attendance form will only be getting the attendance for today. So please, it's open for 1 minute. After that, we'll just we will not be showing the code. Anyone filling the form after 7 p.m. or 7:15 p.m. will not be considering their attendance. So please, if you are willing to fill the form after the session, just fill it out within 10 to 15 minutes, else we'll not be considering that. Yesterday, few people have filled the form after 12 a.m. That is on 23rd July. That is today. Okay, so we'll not be considering that, and code will not be sent in the chat box. You will have to see it from the screen only. Okay.
All right, I guess that was enough time. Cool. Coming back to our CSS, we have
कोड फिर से दिखाएंगे.
Okay, last 10 seconds for everyone. After that, we will not be showing the code. Just take a screenshot or write it down quickly. It's a small code. All right. So coming back to CSS, we have two more things to discuss. We just saw how Flex works in order to make our website responsive. And we also saw how we can use media queries in order to make our website responsive. By responsive, I mean that the website responds to different screen sizes or changes in the screen size, right? Because like it's 2021 and we have to support a bunch of different screen sizes, including foldables for some reason now. And yeah, we saw Flex, we saw media queries. The next thing to discuss is Grid. Grid is another system where it should be pretty clear from the name itself. We create a grid of elements. We arrange the elements in a bunch of rows and columns. Due to time constraints, I won't be going much into grid, but just to give you a brief overview, instead of display flex, you would have to write display grid. And then for the elements that you have over here, you need to add the properties for their columns and rows. So you can check it out in the grid reference over here. Go to grid, basic layouts of a grid. And then you would be able to like very clearly see how a grid works and what are the different possibilities by using grid. Coming back to the code, we are almost out of time, so we are just going to discuss one last thing, which are units. Right now, you must have seen that we have been using pixels everywhere, but we don't have just pixels. We have a bunch of different options available to us. And pixels, what it does is it basically covers that much scaled pixels, that much scaled units. But it won't really be responsive for, and it won't really look good on all different screen sizes. So 20 pixels may look good on my desktop or my laptop. But if someone's resolution changes, or the display resolution changes, or if their display size changes, then pixels don't really scale very well with that. And in order to accommodate those kind of situations, we have a bunch of other units available with us as well. And these units, like you can use these units at different places. You can use them for font sizes. You can use them for border widths. You can use them on margins and paddings. Do also read about margins and paddings as well. It should be pretty self-explanatory, but still, just to give you a short example, let's add a margin over here. In this red div, we are selecting the red div. Let's add a margin of 20 pixels. And on all sides, we added a space of 20 pixels. But then we also have padding. And since we already have a border over here, the difference between a margin and a padding should be pretty clear to you. Right, so what margin does is it adds space outside this element, between this element and the other elements. And what padding does is it adds space inside the element. So whatever the children of the elements that we have would get this space, which we have defined in the padding, from the borders of our element. So if we selected red div, we added a padding of 40 pixels. From the border of red div, the children would be pushed 40 pixels inside on all sides. This is how margin and padding works. And coming back to the units, we have basically two different types of units. There's an absolute unit. Pixel is an absolute unit. And then there are relative units. You should always try to use relative units as much as possible, because as the name suggests, they are relative to the size of the user screen. So your content would then be very easily be able to grow or shrink with the size of the screen of the user's device. And there are a lot of different absolute units, a lot of different relative units. Let's just discuss two relative units available to us. Let's change this margin to, or rather instead of the margin, let's change the font size. That would be more clearly visible. Let's keep it to 1 EM. EM means the size of the current font. Now, everything has a default CSS. So body has a default CSS in every browser. The default font is somewhere around 12 pixels, I think. I may be wrong, let me know if I'm wrong. And if you write 1 EM, that's 1 times the size of the current font. You write 2 EM, it's 2 times the size of the current font. 3 EM is 3 times, and so on. You can also give values with a floating point, so it can be 2.5 as well, or 1.5. And apart from EM, we also have VH, which stands for viewport height. So this would take 1% of the height of this viewport. You can change it to 2 or 3. And it would take that much percentage of the height of your viewport. And then we have viewport width. So width, just like height, would take that much percentage of the width of your viewport. And apart from these, we also have a bunch of other relative units available to us and a lot of other absolute units available to us. All of them have their own places. All of them can be used in certain different scenarios, but try to prefer relative units. And if you do that, then it would be very easy for you to make your website responsive and also accommodate a bunch of different screen sizes. Yeah, so that's basically CSS. Now, there are other properties, there are other units that you need to read about. The links would be shared with you after this session. Yeah, that's all from my side. Thank you, everyone. Devesh, if you have anything to say, please feel free to add anything.
No, Dean, that was a really good session. So, yeah, thank you, everyone.
Sir, I have a doubt. Hello.
Yeah, please continue.
Sir, like in Android, we have dependent pixels, DPIs. So is there any such thing like DPs in CSS? That if we change certain devices, it will automatically get the size of the display and then
Okay,
fix the content.
got it. So, like DPs in Android, like they are actually independent of the size of a single pixel. But even if you use DP in Android, it won't really scale with the resolution of the device. So on a device with a screen of, let's say, a 720p screen, 12 dp would look a lot bigger than 12 dp would look on a device with a 1440 pixel screen.
Yes, sir.
Right. So an equivalent to dp would actually be pixels over here. If you have something of 40 pixels over here, then it would look smaller on a screen with more pixel density, and it would look bigger on a screen with less pixel density. If you want to actually scale it with the size of the device, depending on what the actual size of the device is, you can either use EMs, like EMs and REMs. These are the preferred ways to set the font sizes, actually, just like you set font sizes using SP in Android.
Yes, sir.
And if you want to like set the height or width of an element as opposed to the font size, a better way to do that would be to use viewport height and viewport width, or you can also use percentage. So percentages are relative to the parent element, which can be a bit confusing at sometimes, but you can use those. So these would make it actually more responsive than pixels or dps.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions? All right, if there are no other questions, one final note for everyone would be, we've covered the very basics of HTML. We've covered the very basics of CSS. And you have links to the reference of HTML and a reference guide for CSS. So kind of think of it as an assignment or a practice for you. But what I would like you to do is to read through these reference docs and try to create a simple web page, a very simple single web page that has your name, your image, and some details about you. Try to arrange the details in any manner that you want, any manner that you think looks good or that represents you. And try to do this before tomorrow's session, and then we'll discuss about JavaScript tomorrow. All right. Thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you, everyone.